The night had fallen softly upon the stone walls of a castle nestled deep in the heart of medieval France. Outside, the air was cool and heavy, with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. From the village below, faint echoes of laughter and the creaking of wooden carts drifted upward, muffled by distance, until they blended with the steady hum of crickets in the grass. Within the castle, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional snap of firewood in the great hall's hearth. In one of the upper chambers, a single candle flickered, casting long, golden shadows across carved beams and tapestries. A girl sat quietly upon a wooden bench near the window, her linen gown loose about her shoulders. She was no more than 12 years old, though her posture was practiced into the poise expected of noble daughters. Her name was Isabelle of Montclair, and she was waiting. Waiting for what? She could not yet say, but she had overheard enough whispers among the servants to know that her life was about to change. The candle's flame wavered as the chamber door opened. A woman entered Isabelle's mother, Lady Marguerite, her face pale in the dim light, framed by the soft folds of a woolen veil. She smiled gently, though her eyes carried the weight of worry. "My child," she whispered, her voice calm, as if afraid the stone walls themselves might listen. "You must prepare yourself. The time is nearer than you think." Isabelle tilted her head, her dark eyes wide. "For what, mother?" "For marriage," came the quiet reply. The word lingered in the air, heavy and unfamiliar, though Isabelle had heard it often in lessons with the household priest. Marriage, a union blessed by God, a duty of daughters to their families. To Isabelle, it had always seemed a matter of adults, far from the quiet games she played with her younger siblings, or the hours she spent tracing patterns on cold window glass. Now, suddenly, it was hers. Lady Marguerite seated herself beside her daughter and reached for her hand. The girl's fingers were small and cold, like the petals of a flower, not yet opened. "You are young, I know," Marguerite continued, "but our house depends upon this bond. Lord de Vervins has agreed that his son, only a little older than you, will take your hand in time. The betrothal will be spoken of tomorrow. It is the way of things, Isabelle." The girl lowered her gaze, watching the candlelight flicker across the polished wood of the bench. She did not yet understand alliances, nor dowries, nor the delicate balance of land and loyalty that tied one noble family to another. But she understood the look in her mother's eyes, the mixture of hope and resignation. "I am afraid," Isabelle whispered. Her mother brushed her cheek. "All brides are afraid, even those who are older than you. But the church will bless your union, and in the eyes of God, you will do no more than what is right." Beyond the chamber walls, the castle stirred with quiet life. Servants padded softly along the corridors, carrying jugs of water, tending to the embers in the hearth. Somewhere below, the cook's voice rose faintly as she scolded an apprentice for spilling flour upon the rushes. The castle was both alive and silent, as though holding its breath. From the window, Isabelle looked down upon the village. She saw faint lanterns bobbing along the main street, where peasants finished their day's work. The girls of the village, some not much older than herself, were gathered at the well, laughing as they drew water. They would not marry so young, Isabelle thought. Not unless their parents deemed it wise. For them, life's rhythm was slower, marked by harvests and feasts, not by the urgency of noble alliances. She wondered, for a fleeting moment, what it might be like to walk among them, free of titles, free of promises spoken in candlelit halls. Later, as the hour deepened and the moon hung high, Isabelle's father entered the chamber. Lord Guillaume was a tall man, with stern features, softened by weariness. He regarded his daughter quietly, as though seeing not only the child before him, but also the future she represented: alliances, heirs, the continuation of his line. "You will do well," he said at last, his voice low but steady. "You are of Montclair blood. You will honor our house." Isabelle nodded, though she felt the weight of those words press upon her small shoulders. She wanted to ask if she might still run in the meadows, still chase the geese by the pond, still laugh at the stories told by the old minstrel in this courtyard. But she knew such questions would sound childish. And tonight, more than ever, she wanted to be grown, to prove herself worthy of the duty placed before her. As the candle burned lower, the chamber filled with the soft fragrance of melted wax. Isabelle lay upon her bed, the linen sheets cool against her skin, her thoughts restless. She imagined the boy she was promised to the son of Lord de Vervins. She had seen him once at a feast, a pale-faced youth with careful manners, perhaps 13 or 14 years old. He had spoken little, and she had not dared meet his gaze. Tomorrow their names would be bound together in words spoken by priests. And though the marriage would not be consummated for some years, the betrothal itself would change her life forever. The thought both frightened and calmed her. It was as though she were standing at the edge of a vast forest, the path ahead shrouded in mist, yet inevitable. Outside, the night deepened further. The bells of the chapel tolled once, echoing across the hills, then faded. The wind whispered through the cracks of the stone walls. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cried out. Isabelle closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the medieval night, the shuffle of guards on the battlements, the faint clink of chainmail, the soft hoot of an owl in the forest. Each sound wove itself into a tapestry of life that would continue long after her own story had changed. And as sleep began to claim her, she thought once more of the word her mother had spoken: marriage, a word heavy with duty, yet softened by candlelight and her mother's gentle touch. She did not know what the morrow would bring, but she knew this: her childhood was slipping into memory, and the world of women, alliances, and vows awaited her. The dawn came slowly, gray and muted, seeping across the hills like water spilled upon stone. The castle stirred with the first rustle of servants carrying buckets of cold well water up steep staircases, their wooden clogs tapping lightly against the worn steps. Smoke curled upward from the kitchen chimney, and soon the scent of baking bread drifted through the corridors. In her chamber, Isabelle was woken by the soft touch of her nurse, a woman whose hands bore the marks of long labor, yet moved with surprising gentleness. "Come, my little dove," the nurse whispered. "Today you must shine before all who gather." Isabelle sat up, her dark hair tumbling in loose strands around her face. The nurse combed it carefully, weaving ribbons of pale blue silk through the braids, while outside the faint toll of chapel bells called the villagers to morning prayer. Each sound seemed to remind Isabelle of the day's wait. By mid-morning, the great hall was alive with voices. Nobles in bright-colored tunics and gowns embroidered with gold thread filled the chamber, their laughter mingling with the shuffle of boots upon the rush-strewn floor. Sunlight streamed through tall, narrow windows, striking sparks of light upon polished goblets and gilded candlesticks. At the high table sat Lord Guillaume of Montclair, his wife Marguerite at his side. Before them lay a feast of roasted meats, fresh loaves of bread, and honey-glazed apples. Yet it was not the food that drew the eyes of the gathered company. It was the ceremony soon to unfold. Isabelle entered quietly, escorted by her mother. Her gown was of soft wool, dyed in shades of pale ivory, simple yet elegant, with sleeves that trailed like wings. Around her neck hung a small cross of silver, the gift of her father upon her baptism. She felt every gaze upon her as she walked, each step carrying her further from the world of childhood and deeper into the realm of duty. Across the hall, she saw him, Charles de Vervins, the boy who would one day be her husband. He stood stiffly near his father, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his expression solemn beyond his years. At perhaps 13 or 14, he looked both older and younger all at once, a child clothed in the weight of expectation. Their eyes met only briefly before both lowered their gaze. The priest stepped forward, his robes heavy with embroidered symbols of faith, a golden crucifix hanging from his neck. He raised his hands, and the hall fell into silence. "In the eyes of God and his holy church," he intoned, his voice deep and measured. we gather to witness the sacred promise between the House of Montclair and the House of Vervins. Though the marriage will be fulfilled in years to come, today the vows of betrothal shall be spoken." He beckoned the children forward. Isabelle's heart raced as she approached the altar set at the hall's center. The priest placed a worn Bible upon the cloth and guided their small hands to rest lightly upon it. "Repeat after me," he said, first to Charles, then to Isabelle. The words were ancient, familiar to all who had heard them before, vows of loyalty, fidelity, and obedience. Charles spoke them in a steady voice, though it trembled faintly on the last syllable. When it came to Isabelle's turn, her own voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to carry through the hush of the hall. With each word, she felt a thread bind her to the boy beside her, invisible, yet unbreakable. When the vows were done, Lord de Vervins placed upon the table a chest of silver coins and a deed to several acres of fertile land. This was the dowry promised for Isabelle's handwealth and land that would strengthen the bond between their families. Murmurs of approval rippled among the assembled nobles, for alliances were as much about land and power as they were about love. A goblet of spiced wine was passed between the fathers, sealing the agreement. The priest offered his blessing, making the sign of the cross over the young pair. And with that, Isabelle of Montclair and Charles de Vervins were bound not yet man and wife, but no longer free children of their own households. The feast that followed was rich and long. Platters of venison, roasted fowl, and fresh-caught fish were carried through the hall. Minstrels struck up gentle tunes on lute and harp, their melodies weaving softly through the clamor of voices. Jesters tumbled and capered near the hearth, drawing laughter from the younger squires. Isabelle sat beside her mother at the high table, picking at her food with little appetite. She felt the eyes of guests upon her, weighing, judging, imagining the woman she would one day become. At one point, Charles glanced at her from across the table. For a moment, their eyes lingered, and in that brief exchange, Isabelle thought she saw not duty nor alliance, but a flicker of the same uncertainty she herself felt. They were both children, after all, caught in a net woven long before their birth. As the sun lowered and the shadows grew long across the hall, the priest rose once more to offer a final blessing. Candles were lit, their flames dancing in the draught, casting golden halos around the carved beams of the ceiling. The company lifted their goblets in a solemn toast, to Montclair, to Vervins, to the promise of union. Isabelle's father placed his hand upon her shoulder. "You have done well," he murmured, pride softening his stern features. And though she smiled faintly, her heart remained restless. That night, when the hall lay quiet once more, and the revelers had retired to their chambers, Isabelle returned to her room. She stood by the window, gazing out upon the moonlit village. The peasants were already asleep, their cottages dark and still. Only the faint glow of the chapel lanterns remained. She pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer, not for wealth, nor power, nor even love, but for strength. Strength to walk the path laid before her, though it stretched long and uncertain into the mist of years. Outside, the bells tolled midnight. The vow was sealed. The world had shifted. And in the silence of her candlelit chamber, Isabelle of Montclair began her journey into womanhood. Time, in the castle, had a slow and obedient gait. The days after the betrothal were measured not in the suddenness of change, but in the rattling of routine, the rise of the sun, the clink of keys in a steward's hand, the hush of prayers at terce. For Isabelle, those first years were a kind of patient schooling, not only in letters and needlework, but in the small, exacting arts that would shape a noblewoman's life. She awoke each morning to the murmur of the household. The nurse would lift the curtain at the first gray light and set a basin of water on the small table by her bed. The simple ritual splash of cold, the swish of linen, became a comfort more than a chore. Evenings were given to embroidery, the slow looping of thread that taught steadiness as much as pattern. The rhythm of the needle under her fingers sounded, to Isabelle, like the beating of a smaller, private drum that marked the passing of years. Her lessons were varied. From the chaplain, she learned the prayers, the psalms that one murmured in the quiet hours, and the phrases of Latin that would one day sound fitting in a household account or a letter. From the lady-in-waiting, she learned posture and the careful art of conversation, how to listen more than speak, how to ask a question that revealed nothing, and yet invited the other person to reveal themselves. From the steward, she learned the language of land, how a field was counted, when meadows should be left to rest, what made a tenant trustworthy. These were not merely academic teachings. They were the tools Isabelle would use when her hand would come to hold keys to storerooms, when her voice would decide which poor family received grain at Michaelmas. There were afternoons when the castle opened like a slow, secret world to her. She would walk the inner ward, her skirts ringing softly against the cobbles, and watch the servants move as a single, practiced tide. The cooks sang under their breath while kneading bread. An apprentice faltered before a pot of broth, and the master cook's reprimand fell like a dry twig. Outside the outer gate, peasants passed with bundles, their faces lined by sun and wind, and Isabelle learned to read their hands as well as their words, calloused palms from the plow, a thumb gone rough from repairing nets. In the marketplace, she listened. There, the world of barter and gossip reached into the life of the castle, like a faint wind carrying far-off seeds. Not all lessons were gentle. One winter, the harvest failed in one of the manor's outlying hamlets. A delegation of tenants came to the castle to plead for relief. Isabelle watched, hidden at the edge of the great hall, while her father and the steward spoke in low tones. She could see the dust on the men's legs, the worry carved into the widow's face, who clutched a child to her breast. Later, in the privacy of her chamber, she unpicked a seam she had just sewn, able only to feel the thin, heavy sorrow that had lodged itself under her ribs. It was the first time she understood that decisions made in a warm hall could shape the hollow of a child's stomach many miles away. Sometimes, Marguerite took her daughter beyond the castle walls. These excursions were small acts of liberation, a companionable walk to the stream, a visit to the chapel where the novice nuns tended an herb garden, or a trip to see a neighboring noblewoman who had recently borne a child. In that domestic sphere, where women mended, blessed, and gave counsel, Isabelle learned what was passed from mother to daughter, beyond books and sermons. She learned the temper of milk for a babe, the signal of an infant's fever, the way a woman's hands moved when she stitched a wound. Marguerite, in those moments, spoke plainly about what Isabelle could expect: the cares of managing a household, the solitude that often accompanied authority, and the quiet pride of ordering a feast that fed men, women, and children alike without shame. Her thoughts, however, often drifted to Charles. In the years after their betrothal, he remained a presence like a distant bell, audible, regular, never quite close enough to be touched. They saw one another at seasonal gatherings, harvest feasts, the Feast of St. Martin, weddings of cousins, and each meeting was wrapped in the same formality as the last. He had grown in ways that made him seem taller and more composed. Once, at a midsummer fair, Isabelle watched him help to calm a frightened mare. The sight unknotted something within her. Here was a strength that was neither cruel nor boastful, and it comforted the knot of anxious questions she kept like secret stones in her heart. Isabelle also watched the marriages around her, and she noticed the differences between unions born of privilege and those born of necessity. In the village, she observed the slow unions of the peasant girls, who often married nearer to their 18th or 20th year, when hands were sure and debts were to be carried by 2 shoulders instead of 1. These marriages were practical, meant to bind 2 families of labor and support, and they carried a warmth shaped by shared work. The bride would stand amid the smoke of the longhouse, her hair braided and tied with a ribbon, and the yard would fill with neighbors who who had come with bowls and songs. Love, perhaps, grew after vows in that life. It grew as a vine grows up a trellis, patient and green. At court, among the lesser nobility, the shape of marriage was different. Alliances were forged as one forges metal, struck together to become stronger, sometimes at the cost of tenderness. Isabelle saw women of titles settle with the measured grace of those who had long practiced containment. She saw the sacrifice of independence made without spectacle, the exchange of youthful frolic for a seat at a draughty table, and the authority to command servants and tenants. None of this repelled her. Instead, it filled her with a sober knowledge that a life of responsibility could be a kind of power. It was not the dream of ballads, but its own subtle and enduring song. There were nights when the weight of expectation kept her awake. She would lie in her narrow bed and listen to the castle breathe, the distant snore of the cook, the muffled step of a night watchman, the ratchet of wind against timber. Often she would press her ear to the cool stone of the wall and imagine that, if she held still enough, she could hear the centuries, the footsteps of women who had once occupied this very chamber. The whispered vows and secret laments sewn into mortar. In those moments, a gentle fear would rise inside her, like a small animal startled in the grass, and she would whisper prayers for courage until sleep came over her like a soft shawl. Her companions in these years were not only the older women who tutored her, but also a small circle of girls from neighboring households. They met in the garden, beneath the espalier of fruit trees, and there they exchanged the few freedoms available to them: shared bread, stolen berries, the daring of trading confidences. One of them, Tallis, was a shepherd's daughter who had been taken occasionally to the castle to help with spinning. Tallis married at 19, and Isabelle attended the wedding, sitting in the back where the church candles glowed like a smattering of stars. After the service, Isabelle watched Tallis laugh openly, and it struck her then that laughter could be honest and large in a life that others might call small. As the years turned, Isabelle's body changed. Her limbs filled out, and a new gravity settled into her hips. There came a season when the priest spoke to her gently about souls and bodies, about the church's wisdom that the consummation of a marriage should wait until both were mature. The words should have eased her, but they brought instead a curious mixture of relief and impatience. Relief that the right would come in time, impatience at the slow unfolding of a future that felt both near and unreachable. In the quiet of an autumn afternoon, Isabelle visited the boundary stones of her dowry fields with the steward. They walked through tall grass gone fire-colored, stopping where the carved rock marked the edge between Montclair soil and a neighbor's parcel. The steward spoke with a casual authority about covenants and rents, and Isabelle listened as if the syllables were seeds falling into fertile earth. When a hedgekeeper offered his advice about mulberry planting, she stored that counsel as a precious ledger entry in her mind. There was a steadiness in the work that suited her. The future, she thought, would not be only a matter of idle gowns and stuck-in mourning, but a complex weave of obligations she could, perhaps, learn to shape. Often, during the hush before dawn, Marguerite would come and sit with her daughter. They would hold hands in silence and watch the slow change of light. Sometimes, Marguerite spoke of her own youth, of how she had been promised at 13, how she had struggled with loneliness, and how she had found, in the ordering of the household, a kind of unexpected companionship. "You will have grief," she said once, plucking at a loose thread in Isabelle's sleeve. "And you will have joy. One will not come without the other. But there is a steadiness to it, my bird. Steadiness you will learn to keep." Isabelle took those words into herself, as into a small hollow. The years of waiting taught her patience, yes, but also preparation. She learned to measure time not by the strike of big events, but by the accumulation of small acts, an account balanced. A child taught to read a prayer. A neighbor helped in a season of need. Each act was a stitch in the larger cloth of life she was being taught to weave. And so the days folded into one another. The promise made in the great hall remained, like a thread running through her days, visible if one knew where to look, invisible to those who did not. Isabelle grew into her promise the way a vine grows into a lattice, slowly, with the careful guidance of hands that know the shape the plant should one day take. She did not yet know the depth of the river that waited beyond the bank of her adolescence. She only knew enough to keep her footing and to learn how to build a bridge. The chill of late autumn settled upon Montclair when word arrived that Charles, Isabelle's betrothed, would return from his training. He had been gone for many years, sent first to another noble household to learn manners of court, then to the camp of his uncle to be schooled in the arts of war. Isabelle had last seen him as a boy of 12, awkward in his manners, his voice breaking with youth. Now he would return as a young man, near 19, with the weight of expectation upon his shoulders. The household stirred with quiet anticipation. Servants swept the halls, tapestries were shaken of dust, and the kitchens smoked with the scent of roasting meat. Isabelle, standing in her chamber, felt her heart shift with unease. For though she was bound to him by contract, Charles was nearly a stranger. When the day came, she stood with her parents upon the steps of the hall. The sky was washed pale, the trees bare, but for stubborn leaves clinging in rust-colored clusters. The sound of hooves grew nearer, until a company of riders crested the rise, their banners snapping in the cold wind. At their head rode Charles. He was not the boy Isabelle remembered. His shoulders were broad now, his posture proud. His face, though youthful still, bore the marks of sun and wind, his jaw stronger, his gaze sharper. He dismounted with practiced ease and bowed low before Lord and Lady Montclair. "Father, mother," he said with solemnity, "I return as promised." And then his eyes fell upon Isabelle. For a moment, silence held between them. He studied her with a mixture of curiosity and recognition, as though piecing together the child he had once known with the young woman who now stood before him in her embroidered gown. Isabelle, for her part, felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She lowered her gaze in the manner taught by the sisters at Sainte Marie, yet she could not keep from glancing at him again, quickly, uncertainly. That evening, a feast was held in the great hall. The hearth blazed with fire, shadows leaping across stone walls, hung with hunting trophies and woven banners. The long tables groaned with platters of venison, spiced pears, and trenchers piled high with bread. Charles sat near Isabelle, his manner courteous, yet formal. They exchanged words, their voices low amid the laughter and clamor of the hall. "You have changed," he said at last, with a faint smile. "As have you," Isabelle replied softly. He laughed, a sound deeper than she remembered, and for a fleeting moment she saw not the noble heir, but the boy who had once chased geese across the courtyard. In the days that followed, Isabelle and Charles spent more time together, though always under the careful eye of chaperones. They walked the gardens, their breath rising in the cold air, speaking of the years apart. Charles told her of the tilt yard, of learning to bear a sword and shield, of harsh winters spent in barracks. "I longed for home more than once," he confessed as they paused by the frozen fountain. "And yet, I knew I must prove myself worthy, not only to my father, but—" He hesitated, his breath misting before him. "But to you." Isabelle's heart stirred at his words. She did not answer at once, for her upbringing taught her modest silence. Yet she felt a warmth beneath her calm, a quiet hope that perhaps their union would be more than mere duty. Still, beneath the surface of their reunion, shadows lingered. Charles spoke often of duty to his family, to his lands, to the crown. And Isabelle could not forget what Sister Claire had whispered in the Abbey gardens, that strength comes not from certainty, but from growing into one's burdens. One evening, as the two sat by the fire, Isabelle dared to ask, "Do you ever fear it? The weight of what lies before us?" Charles looked at her, surprised. For a moment, he was silent. Then he said, more softly than she had ever heard him speak. Every day. Their eyes met then, not as strangers bound by a contract, but as two souls caught in the same web of expectation. It was a fragile moment, yet it bound them more strongly than any parchment seal. Winter deepened. Snow lay thick upon the hills, muffling sound, softening even the sharp edges of Montclair's towers. Inside the hall, fires crackled, and preparations for the coming spring were discussed in hushed tones. For with the thaw would come the time to announce Isabelle and Charles's wedding formally. One night, as Isabelle prepared for rest, she lingered by her window. The moon cast pale light upon the courtyard below, where Charles paced alone, his cloak trailing over the snow. He paused, tilting his face upward, as though sensing her gaze. For the briefest instant, their eyes met across the cold night air. Isabelle felt her breath catch. Then Charles inclined his head, slowly, deliberately, before turning back into the shadows. Thus, the season closed. And as spring drew nearer, Isabelle understood that her life, once sheltered in abbey cloisters and guarded halls, was opening into a new and uncertain chapter. She was no longer simply a daughter of Montclair. She was the betrothed of a young lord who would, one day, command men, lands, and her heart. And she knew, with a mixture of fear and quiet anticipation, that the true test of her strength was yet to come. The autumn sun slipped lower with each passing day, its golden rays thinning into pale threads across the land. In the village fields, the last sheaves of wheat had been gathered, tied in bundles, and carted to the castle granaries. Smoke rose from hearths as peasants dried beans and peas, stacked hay for the oxen, and salted what meat they could afford. From the battlements, Isabelle watched the landscape transform, each furrow in the earth dark and damp with recent rains. She breathed in the scent of wet soil, of wood smoke drifting on the crisp air. Autumn had always been her favorite season. The world seemed to fold into itself, preparing for rest. Yet this year, she sensed unease. Her fears proved true when the steward brought troubling news. "My lady," he said one morning, bowing low in the solar, "the harvest was poor. Too much rain in spring, too little sun in summer. The villagers whisper of hunger to come. Already they worry their seed stores will not last the winter." Isabelle's brow furrowed. "And our granaries? Better stocked than the village, but not full. The Lord has his obligations, levies to pay, soldiers to feed. If we portion too generously, we risk displeasure from the crown." The words weighed on her chest like stones. To hoard would breed resentment. To give freely would leave them vulnerable. It was a cruel balance, one she had never faced as a daughter, but now must shoulder as a wife, as lady. That evening, Charles convened his council. The hall glowed with torchlight, shadows flickering across stern faces. Knights and advisors spoke in sharp tones, debating numbers, debating lives. "We cannot feed every mouth," one declared. "The king's tithe must be met first." "If the villagers starve," another retorted, "who will till the fields come spring? Who will pay rent or raise arms when called?" The words tumbled back and forth like dice on a gaming board. Isabelle listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her heart aching with each cold calculation. Finally, when the debate lulled, she spoke. "My lords," she said softly, "forgive a woman's voice among such weighty matters. But I have seen the children of the village thin already, their eyes hollow with want. If hunger takes them, it will not be numbers on parchment that we lose, but the very lifeblood of this land." A hush fell. Some frowned, others looked away. Charles's gaze lingered on her, thoughtful. "We shall portion the grain," he said at last. "Less than the villagers desire, but more than the steward counsels. Enough to see them through, if God is merciful." Word of the decision spread quickly. Some villagers grumbled it was too little. Others wept with gratitude. Isabelle walked among them the next day, cloaked against the chill, her presence drawing cautious bows. She spoke kindly, asking after their health, their families. A mother pressed her infant into Isabelle's arms, whispering, "May Our Lady bless you," my lady, for remembering us." The child's weight, fragile yet warm, settled against her shoulder. Isabelle felt a strange mixture of sorrow and strength, as if the babe had given her a silent vow to care, to endure, to protect. But not all were pleased. Late one night, as Isabelle sat in her chamber, a maid entered in haste. "My lady," she whispered. "A scuffle in the village. Men fighting over bread. One struck another dead." The words chilled her. She dismissed the maid and hurried to the window, staring out into the darkness where the village fires smoldered. Hunger was not only an emptiness of the belly, it was a spark that could ignite violence, rebellion, despair. Charles returned late, his cloak damp with night air, his jaw set hard. He said little, but Isabelle could see the weight pressing him down. She longed to speak, to offer comfort, yet she held her tongue. This was a burden he must carry as lord, but it was hers as well, whether he acknowledged it or not. As days passed, Isabelle resolved to act where she could. She opened the still room, directing the women to brew broths from herbs, to make poultices for coughs and fevers. She ordered the kitchens to prepare thin pottage for the poorest families, using scraps and bones that might otherwise be discarded. At first, some knights scoffed. "A lady's charity cannot fill empty bellies," they muttered. Yet gradually, Isabelle noticed a change. The villagers' eyes softened when they spoke her name, gratitude rippling through the cold autumn air. Even Charles, though he said little, seemed to watch her more closely, as if weighing not only her words, but her quiet persistence. One afternoon, as she walked alone in the courtyard, she encountered Father Bernard, the castle priest. His hands were ink-stained from scripture, his robe patched from years of wear. "You carry a heavy burden, child," he said gently, as though reading her heart. "Too heavy," she whispered. "I fear I am not strong enough." He placed a hand upon her shoulder. Strength is not always the loud voice in the hall, nor the sword upon the field. Sometimes it is the steady flame, small yet unwavering, that guides others through the dark. His words lingered within her, long after he had gone, warming her against the chill winds that swept through the land. Winter loomed close now, its breath sharp upon the fields. The granaries stood guarded, the kitchens busier than ever. And though hunger prowled at the edges of Auvray, there was still life, still laughter, children chasing each other through frost, women singing softly as they spun wool, men raising cups by the hearth in weary fellowship. Isabelle watched it all, a quiet sentinel. She knew harder trials would come, famine, plague, the summons of kings, perhaps even war. Yet for now, she held to the vow she had whispered in her heart, to be more than a bride in silk, more than a name in an alliance, to be, truly, the Lady of Auvray. The bells of the abbey tolled softly in the dusk, their bronze voices echoing across the rolling fields of Burgundy. Isabelle, scarcely 14, stood by the narrow window of her chamber, her gaze fixed upon the horizon, where the last light of day led into the earth. Her fingers toyed with the ribbon of her gown, nervous yet calm, for she already knew that the next season of her life had been written long before she could read or write. She was promised. In the world of medieval Europe, such promises were rarely born of affection. A girl of noble blood, like Isabelle, often found herself betrothed while still a child. Sometimes at 7, sometimes at 9, agreements were sealed with the press of a seal and the clasp of men's hands. The church permitted the formal consummation of marriage only after a girl reached 12, though custom and decency often delayed it until 14 or 15. Isabelle herself had been spoken for at 9 years old, the parchment signed and the future carved. Yet only now, in her early youth, would the words of that contract come alive. Her father's lands lay fragile on the border between two rival lords. Her union was not for love, but for peace, to bind one family's spears to another's shields. And so it was that Isabelle, with her soft voice and curious eyes, became a thread woven into the vast tapestry of politics. The abbess who guided her whispered that obedience was her virtue, that duty was her crown. Isabelle listened, though her heart stirred with questions. Did other girls feel this same tightening around their lives? Did peasant daughters, married at 12 to farmers twice their age, tremble as she did tonight? Or did they accept it, as natural as the turning of the seasons? Her wedding day dawned cold, though it was midsummer. She walked the flagstoned aisle of the chapel, draped in white linen, the scent of beeswax candles thick in the air. Her husband-to-be, Henri of Valmont, was scarcely older than she, 16, with a thin frame, but the proud bearing of his lineage. Their hands were joined, and a strip of embroidered cloth was wound about them, the priest's voice rising as he declared their flesh and fortunes bound. To Isabelle, it felt like a dream, and perhaps that was the mercy of it. The priest spoke of holy duty, of children yet unborn, of God's plan, and though her voice quavered, she said the words as countless other brides before her had done, "I will." Outside, the villagers gathered to cheer, for to them the union meant stability, fewer wars, fewer burned fields. A noble marriage was never private. It echoed through the lives of serfs, merchants, priests, and soldiers alike. In the hush of her chamber that night, Isabelle wondered if her future would be gentle or cruel. But such was the path of countless young women across Europe, from the castles of France to the farmsteads of England, from the merchant houses of Italy to the fishing villages of Spain. Daughters were bartered and bound. Some rose to queenship, their voices echoing in courts. Others vanished into obscurity, their names forgotten, but their sacrifices shaping the quiet peace of their homes. And Isabelle, so young yet already burdened, lay awake under the embroidered canopy, her heart uncertain, her life already claimed. The morning after her wedding, Isabelle stepped out into the courtyard of Chateau Valmont. The stone walls loomed higher than her father's keep, their banners snapping in the summer breeze. For the first time in her short life, she stood in a home that was hers only by promise, not by memory. The household bustled around her. Servants bowed as she passed, their eyes filled not with warmth, but with careful curiosity. To them, she was not a girl, but a symbol. Her presence meant that peace with Burgundy might endure, that Valmont's harvests would not be seized by raiders, that their children might grow without the shadow of fire. Isabelle felt the weight of their hopes press against her as heavily as the jeweled circlet upon her brow. Henri, her young husband, walked beside her with a stiffness that mirrored her own. He spoke politely, almost shyly, as though he too had been cast into a role not of his choosing. His hand rested briefly upon hers, an awkward attempt at comfort, though his gaze often strayed to the nights, to the matters of men and war. That night, when the great hall filled with music and laughter, Isabelle sat at the long oak table among strangers. Platters of roasted fowl, trenchers of dark bread, and goblets of spiced wine passed before her. Yet her appetite was absent. The minstrels sang of heroes and saints, but all Isabelle could hear was the soft murmur of women at the table's end. They spoke of children, of dowries, of marriages arranged before girlhood had faded. One lady recalled being wed at 13 to a man nearly 40. Another, barely 15, was already mother to 2. Their words were not bitter, but resigned, as though such was the natural course of all things. Isabelle lowered her eyes, realizing she was now part of their unbroken chain. Yet beyond the high tables, the common folk of the village celebrated in their own way. Bonfires burned in the fields, dances circled beneath the stars. For them, a noble marriage was less about the bride's heart and more about survival. A treaty meant fewer levies of soldiers, fewer barns pillaged, fewer husbands taken to fight. Their daughters, too, would marry young, 12, 13, 14, sometimes willingly, sometimes with tears, always bound by the rhythms of survival. In her chamber later, Isabelle lay awake, listening to the sounds of the castle, settling into silence. The tapestries on the walls told stories of saints and warriors, but none showed the quiet burdens of women. She wondered if her life would ever belong to her, or if she would always be a vessel for others' peace, others' ambitions. Still, within her stirred a seed of strength. She remembered her mother's whisper before leaving home. Even a caged bird may learn to sing. And so Isabelle resolved, softly, secretly, that though she had been given away, she would not let her soul be silenced. Her story, like countless others, would not merely be endured. It would be lived. The days that followed unfolded like the weaving of a tapestry, each thread deliberate, each color chosen by another's hand. Isabelle, though but 14, was now mistress of Chateau Valmont in name. In truth, she was still a guest, learning the rhythm of a household not her own. Each morning began with prayer in the chapel. Sunlight filtered through narrow stained glass windows, painting the stone floor with hues of crimson and gold. Isabelle knelt beside Henri, her lips moving with the Latin prayers she scarcely understood. The priest's voice droned on about obedience, fidelity, and the sacred bond of marriage. Yet Isabelle heard them as commands directed at her alone, binding her not merely to God, but to the walls that enclosed her. When Mass was done, the steward guided her through her duties. She was expected to oversee the kitchens, the cellars, the weaving rooms, to ensure order among the servants. At first, Isabelle felt overwhelmed. So many faces, so many tasks. But she quickly realized these responsibilities were less about choice and more about proving her worth. A lady of the castle was not free. She was a guardian of routine, a keeper of others' labor. At night, in the flickering light of the hearth, older women told her stories of their youth. Isabelle listened quietly, as one might listen to the rustle of leaves in autumn. She learned that most noble brides of her time had been married before their hearts had even begun to imagine love. 14 was considered proper. 12 was not rare, sometimes even younger if politics demanded. The church permitted it, so long as the girl's body could bear children. For the continuation of lineage mattered more than childhood itself. In these stories, Isabelle caught glimpses of herself, young wives who had trembled in strange halls, daughters who had left their families with little more than a prayer, girls who had grown into women not by years, but by necessity. Henri remained distant, respectful, yet unsure. He was scarcely older than she, 15 at most, and more interested in jousts and hunting than in his shy bride. Isabelle sensed in him the same uncertainty she carried, though his path was brighter with freedom. He would one day inherit lands, command soldiers, and pledge fealty to kings. She, meanwhile, would be judged by her ability to bear heirs, to keep the peace of the hearth, and to remain dutiful. One evening, while embroidering by candlelight, Isabelle's mind wandered back to her home. She remembered the sound of her little brother's laughter, the warm smell of bread in her mother's kitchen, the quiet freedom of running barefoot across the meadow. That life was gone, sealed by the vows spoken before altar and priest. She was no longer a child of her father's house, but a piece in the chessboard of nobility. And yet, within the silence of her chamber, Isabelle began to see a strange strength in her role. If she could not choose her fate, perhaps she could shape it. She could learn the language of power hidden in small acts, kindness to a servant, wisdom in managing stores, patience in the face of prideful men. These were not victories sung by minstrels, but victories of survival, of resilience. For the women of her world, power was seldom loud. It was silent, woven into the fabric of daily life, passed down through whispers and glances, enduring as quietly as stone walls that outlasted kings. Isabelle resolved to listen well, to learn the silent lessons, and to carry them with her as her truest dowry. Spring returned with the sound of hooves upon muddy roads and the sharp ring of messengers' horns. At Chateau Valmont, the air grew restless. Servants carried baskets of salted meat to the cellars, soldiers sharpened their blades, and men whispered of battles being waged far beyond the green fields. Isabelle sat at her embroidery frame by the window, though her eyes often wandered to the courtyard below. There, Henri trained with the other young squires, his wooden practice sword striking with sudden bursts of energy. He was eager to prove himself, not just as a lord's son, but as a warrior. England stirs again, one of the chambermaids murmured as she lit Isabelle's candles one evening. The 100 years' quarrel never ends. They say more levies will be called, more blood spilled. Isabelle knew the war, though distant, touched every household. The 100 Years' War, stretching like a shadow over generations, meant higher taxes, endless skirmishes, and men taken from the fields. Even noble daughters like herself were not untouched. Marriage alliances, such as her own, were designed to knit families tighter, to hold power against uncertainty. At dinner, Lord Valmont's voice was grave. The king calls his vassals. We must be ready. His gaze fell briefly on Henri, then on Isabelle. And you, child, must learn to hold this household firm, if the men are called away. A shiver passed through her. She was barely 14, yet already entrusted with the idea of command. Could a girl who still longed for the sound of her mother's voice truly hold a fortress together? Days passed, and Isabelle noticed the tension ripple through even the smallest tasks. The steward counted sacks of grain twice over. The chaplain spoke longer sermons, urging the people to endure hardships with faith. Mothers wept quietly as they spun wool, imagining sons who might never return. Yet amid the unease, Isabelle found herself listening more closely. The whispers of women in the kitchens, the anxious talk of peasants in the courtyard, the soft fears spoken at night by servant girls, all carried truths the men above rarely heard. War did not simply belong to knights and kings. It lived in the hunger of fields left unplowed, in the loneliness of empty hearths, in the strength of those left behind. One night, unable to sleep, Isabelle stood at her chamber window. Below, torches flickered along the walls. Beyond them stretched the dark countryside, vast and uncertain. She thought of her marriage, no longer just a family alliance, but a chain that bound her fate to this land. If Henry rode to war, she would remain behind as the Lady of Valmont, guardian of its people. And in that moment, she understood something new. Though still young, her voice, her choices, her steadiness could shape more lives than she had ever imagined. The war was distant, yes, but its shadow had already entered her chamber, curling like smoke around her candle flame. The call to arms came with the pounding of a herald's drum. The sound echoed through the valley, bouncing off the stone walls of Chateau Valmont. And all who heard it knew what it meant. The king's banners had been raised. In the courtyard, men gathered, their armor gleaming dully beneath a sky streaked with storm-colored clouds. Henri stood among them, no longer a boy with wooden swords, but a squire now called to prove himself on the field. His eyes burned with pride and fear both. Isabelle watched from the gallery above, her hands clasped so tightly that the silver ring upon her finger pressed into her skin. She tried to appear calm, as a noble daughter should, but her breath betrayed her in shallow tremors. Henri caught her gaze. For a moment, the noise of the courtyard fell away. The smith hammering last-minute repairs, the horses stamping restlessly, the prayers of wives whispered into their husbands' cloaks. All Isabelle saw was Henri, already distant, though he had not yet left. That evening, Lord Valmont gathered the household in the great hall. The banners of France hung heavy above the hearth, and the air smelled of wax and fear. "The king summons us to Normandy," he declared. "Our men ride at dawn." A murmur spread, some proud, some mournful. Isabelle felt her heart sink, but when her father's gaze fell upon her, she lifted her chin. "You will hold this house in my absence," Lord Valmont said firmly. "The people will look to you. Remember, child, a lady's strength is not in the sword, but in her steadiness. Grain must be counted, walls guarded, prayers offered. When men ride to war, women keep the land alive." The words weighed heavy, yet deep within Isabelle, a flame flickered. Could she, still barely 15, truly shoulder such responsibility? That night, sleep did not come. From her window, she watched the moonlight silver the helmets of the men below as they prepared for dawn. She thought of her mother, who once told her, "A woman's strength is often hidden, but without it, no stone of this world would stand." At first light, the courtyard filled with sound, the clatter of hooves, the rasp of armor, the cries of farewell. Henri mounted his horse, his jaw tight with unspoken words. Isabelle moved forward, her linen veil trailing like mist behind her. She reached up, placing her hand on his armored arm. "Go with honor," she whispered, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened. Henri bent slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I will return, Isabelle, for you." Then the horns sounded, sharp and relentless, and the men rode out, their banners snapping in the cold wind. Isabelle stood until the last horse disappeared beyond the hills, the echo of hooves fading into silence. Only then did she allow her tears to fall, hidden beneath the shadow of the gatehouse. She turned back toward the keep, her heart heavy yet resolute. For the first time, Isabelle was no longer merely a daughter or a bride-to-be. She was the lady of the castle, guardian of all that remained. And as the great oak doors closed behind her, she knew the true battle awaiting her would not be fought with swords, but with endurance, wisdom, and faith. The banners of war had long since vanished beyond the horizon, yet their shadow lingered in every corner of Valmont. The courtyard, once filled with the noise of training and laughter, now lay silent, except for the voices of women, children, and the old. Isabelle, wrapped in a woolen cloak against the chill, walked among them with measured steps, her veil brushing the damp stones. Though still but 15, she carried herself as though years had pressed upon her shoulders. Her father's command echoed in her memory: "When men ride to war, women keep the land alive." She descended into the village at the base of the hill. The cottages leaned into one another like weary old men, their thatched roofs darkened by smoke. Chickens scattered at her passing, and children, barefoot, their faces smudged with ash, stared wide-eyed at their lady. At the small square, a murmur rose among the gathered villagers. Isabelle heard snatches of their worries. Fields left untilled. The soldiers took the best horses. The tithe is due, but the granary is half empty. Their words were heavy with fear. Isabelle paused, then lifted her chin, her voice quiet but firm. "Your lord fights for the realm, and for you. Until his return, I shall hear your troubles and carry them with you." An old woman stepped forward, her back bent, her hands raw from labor. "My lady, the children grow hungry. If winter comes before the harvest, we shall not last." Isabelle's heart tightened. She had known hunger only as a tale whispered by nurses, yet here it stood before her, hollow-eyed and trembling. "I will open the castle stores," she said after a pause. "The grain will be measured carefully, but no child will go without bread." Gasps ran through the crowd, some grateful, others doubtful. To share the stores before winter was a dangerous risk. Yet Isabelle held her ground, sensing that a lady's strength lay not only in caution, but in mercy. That evening, she returned to the keep, where the steward frowned at her decision. "My lady, generosity may starve us all when the snows come." Isabelle met his gaze with steady resolve. "If we let them starve now, there will be no village left to feed in spring. Our walls protect nothing, if not the people." The steward bowed reluctantly, and for the first time, Isabelle felt the weight of command settle fully upon her. In the nights that followed, the great hall filled with villagers who came seeking warmth and bread. Isabelle sat among them, listening to their songs, their fears, their small joys. She saw the faces of women mending cloaks by firelight, boys whittling sticks in place of swords, and elders telling stories of better years. It was then she understood. The true nobility of a lady was not in jewels or fine silks, but in being the unseen pillar upon which her people leaned. Beyond the walls, rumors drifted like smoke on the wind. Raiding bands, hungry wolves, tax collectors prowling for the king's due. Yet within Valmont, the hearths burned brighter for her presence. And when Isabelle walked through the hall, carrying loaves of bread with her own hands, the people lowered their heads, not only in respect, but in something deeper: trust. She had begun the slow, quiet work of becoming more than her father's daughter, or a pawn in alliances. She was becoming the Lady of Valmont. The first frost of autumn touched the fields of Valmont with silver. Smoke from the hearths curled into a sky the color of pewter, and the wind carried with it the bite of the coming winter. Isabelle stood at the battlements, her cloak pressed tightly against her shoulders. She watched as peasants moved slowly through the stubbled fields, gathering what little remained of the harvest. Though she had promised her people bread, she could see in their weary movements that the stores would not last. Each sack of grain lifted onto the carts seemed lighter than the last. And yet, she reminded herself, to let them starve now was to let the land itself die. A sudden trumpet call echoed from the gates below. Isabelle turned sharply, her braid whipping across her shoulder. A rider, cloaked in the king's colors, deep crimson with a golden lion, was approaching with a small escort. His arrival stirred unease among the guards, for few royal envoys rode so far north, unless their purpose was urgent. The gates opened, and the party clattered into the courtyard. Isabelle descended the stair, her slippers whispering against the cold stone, and entered the great hall. The envoy stood there already, his cloak flecked with mud from the road, his expression sharpened by travel and pride. His name was Sir Aldrich de Montreux, a man of the king's council, and his eyes fell upon Isabelle with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "My Lady Isabelle of Valmont," he said, bowing shallowly, "I bring word from His Grace, King Philip." Her heart thudded. She lowered her head with grace. "You honor us with your presence, Sir Aldrich. Speak, and we shall listen." He withdrew a sealed parchment and handed it to the steward. The wax bore the royal crest. As the steward broke the seal, Aldrich's voice filled the hall. "By command of His Grace, every lord and lady of the realm shall render an additional levy of grain and silver to support the holy campaigns in the south. The crown requires this tribute within the month. Failure to comply will be met with punishment, as deemed fitting." A ripple of unease spread through the assembled servants and guards. Isabelle felt the weight of every eye upon her. She steadied her breath. "The harvest has been thin this year," she said softly, but clearly. "Our stores are already strained. If we give what the crown demands, how shall my people survive the winter?" Aldrich's gaze hardened. "Your people's survival is a matter for your wisdom, my lady. The crown does not ask. It commands. Grain must be gathered, and silver weighed. The king's armies cannot march on empty stomachs, nor can Christendom be defended without sacrifice." His words were sharp, almost rehearsed, like a sermon he had spoken in many halls before hers. For a moment, Isabelle's knees trembled beneath her gown. She was 15, scarcely more than a child. Yet here she stood before the king's envoy, expected to answer as though she bore decades of authority. But the memory of the villager's eyes, hollow, desperate, rose before her. She clasped her hands together, willing strength into her voice. "I am loyal to His Grace," she said, "but loyalty does not fill empty bellies. If the crown takes more than we can spare, there will be death in Valmont before the snows have melted." Aldrich's lips curved into the faintest smile, though not of kindness. "Then perhaps you should pray that spring comes swiftly, my lady." He leaned closer, lowering his tone so that only she could hear. "Or pray that your betrothal be settled soon. A husband's name carries weight where a maiden's voice does not." The words struck her like a blade. Heat flushed her cheeks, though not from shame, rather from anger. Yet she knew she could not lash out. To defy an envoy was to defy the king himself. She dipped her head in a gesture of obedience. "I will consider the crown's demand." Satisfied, Aldrich bowed curtly and turned away, signaling to his men. Within minutes, they were gone, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. When the great doors shut, the hall seemed to exhale. The steward turned to her, his brow furrowed deeply. "My lady, if we give what the king asks, the people will starve. If we refuse, we invite wrath from Paris itself. What shall we do?" Isabelle did not answer at once. She walked slowly to the long table, her hand brushing across its worn surface, as if the touch of wood could steady her. She thought of her father, far away in the wars. She thought of her mother, buried these many years. She thought of the children she had fed with her own hands in the great hall's hearth. And at last she spoke. "We will give enough to show loyalty, but no more than our people can spare. We shall measure it carefully. The king will have his levy, but Valmont will live." The steward hesitated, then nodded, though the worry did not leave his face. That night, Isabelle could not sleep. She lay in her chamber, staring at the beams above, listening to the crackle of the dying fire. The envoy's words echoed again. A husband's name carries weight where a maiden's voice does not. She was reminded of the path ahead of her. Marriage, alliances, a role not of her own choosing. Yet tonight, she had spoken as a lady of Valmont, not as a bride awaiting a match. She wondered, would history remember her voice, or would it vanish beneath the shadow of some husband's name? Outside, the wind howled across the battlements, and Isabelle whispered into the darkness, "For now, let them remember that I did not bow so easily." The first snow fell in silence, as though the heavens had dropped a white veil across the world. It clung to the towers of Valmont, softened the jagged roofs of the village cottages, and swallowed the fields in a blanket of pale stillness. What had once been earth and harvest was now only frost and emptiness. Isabelle stood at the high window of the solar, watching her people below. The peasants trudged through the courtyard, shoulders bent beneath bundles of firewood, their boots sinking into snow. The smoke that curled from their chimneys smelled of burning bark and peat, fuel gathered in desperation when oak logs had run short. Every day brought her the same sight. The hungry faces of children wrapped in woolen scraps, their eyes wide, following the carts of grain that left the castle gates. And though Isabelle had ordered fair rations, though she had sworn that each family would receive a share, she knew it would never be enough. At the hearth, her steward Etienne warmed his hands against the flames. "My lady," he said, breaking the silence, "the stores grow lighter by the week. Even with your careful measures, we may not last until spring." "Then we must find ways to stretch them further," Isabelle replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Dilute the flour with oats. Boil broth with bones, if meat cannot be found. Hunger will not break us, not while I live." Etienne studied her carefully. She was but 15, her cheeks still soft with youth, yet her eyes carried a weariness that belonged to queens. In the village. That evening, Isabelle walked among the cottages with only a maid and 2 guards. She insisted upon seeing her people with her own eyes, no matter how much the steward fretted over her safety. In one hut, she found a mother huddled beside a straw bed, cradling 2 children whose faces were gaunt as candle stubs. Their father had died in the fields the past summer, taken by fever. Isabelle knelt at the doorway, pressing a loaf of coarse bread into the woman's hands. "Eat, and share it with them," she whispered. The woman's tears glistened in the firelight. "Bless you, my lady. You have the heart of a saint." But Isabelle only shook her head. Not a saint, she thought, only a girl trying not to fail them. As she walked back through the snow, she passed the smithy. Inside, the blacksmith's hammer no longer rang against the anvil. The forge stood cold, for there was no iron left to work, and no coins with which to pay for his craft. Instead, he sat silently by the embers, sharpening old tools and hoping they might last the winter. The village priest approached, his breath steaming in the frozen air. "My lady," he said, bowing, "the people pray for your strength. Yet prayer cannot fill the stomach. If the king demands more tribute, what shall become of us?" Isabelle lifted her gaze toward the castle on the hill. Its towers seemed more like prison bars than shelter. "We will give the king his share," she murmured, "but never all. Valmont must live, even if it means my name is cursed at court." The castle in winter. Back within the castle, winter's grip grew harsher. The great hall, once warm with laughter and feasts, now echoed with the crackling of small, meager fires. Servants wore layers of wool, and even the knights pulled cloaks about their shoulders during supper. Meals grew plainer. Thin stews, crusts of bread, and sometimes only porridge. Gone were the roasted pheasants, the venison, the honeyed pies. Isabelle insisted that her own table match the village's fare. "If my people hunger, so shall I," she declared. One night, as the storm howled beyond the walls, Etienne spoke gravely. "My lady, morale grows thin. Some whisper that Valmont will not endure. There are murmurs of theft from the grain stores, and worse, that men will flee to seek food elsewhere." Isabelle's eyes darkened. "No one must leave. The roads are death in winter, and bandits circle like wolves. Keep the stores watched. Let the people know that I will walk among them, and any man who steals bread steals from his own kin." A moment of solitude. That night, unable to rest, Isabelle walked alone to the chapel. Candles flickered weakly, their flames fighting the draft. She sank to her knees before the Virgin's image, her breath a cloud in the freezing air. "Holy Mother," she whispered, "I am too young for this burden. Yet if you will me to bear it, give me strength, not for myself, but for them." Her words dissolved into silence, but in her heart she felt a small ember kindle, an ember of resolve, fragile yet unyielding, like fire smoldering beneath the snow. The snow did not melt when the sun rose. It thickened. Day after day, pale skies hung low, pressing their weight upon Valmont, as though the world itself had turned its back. What had begun as silence now carried the sound of muffled coughs, hollow cries, and empty stomachs. Hunger had become more than an ache. It was a master, cruel and merciless. Whispers of rebellion. In the lower village, men huddled in barns, their breath freezing in the air. They spoke in low voices, their hands trembling not only from cold, but from fury. "How many days shall we starve?" one muttered, "while the castle still hoards grain?" "They eat better than us," another spat. "They always have, and if the lady is so kind, why do our children faint at the loom? Better we take the stores by force than bury our sons in the snow." The words spread like smoke, slipping into every corner of the village. Some still defended Isabelle, swearing she had shared all she could. But anger gnawed at the starving faster than loyalty could soothe. One night, Etienne came to Isabelle with grave news. "My lady, a crowd gathers in the square. They demand to see the granaries themselves." Isabelle rose at once. She wrapped herself in a cloak, ignoring the steward's protests, and went down to the gates. Torches burned in the storm, their flames flickering against the white night. Faces, pale, hollow, desperate, turned toward her. Mothers clutched infants too weak to cry. Men held axes, scythes, broken staves. "My people," Isabelle began, her voice carrying above the wind. "I know your suffering. You think the castle feasts while you starve. But come, see with your own eyes." She ordered the gates opened and led them to the granary. When the great wooden doors creaked apart, the truth revealed itself. Bins of grain nearly empty, only thin sacks stacked against the walls. "This," Isabelle said, spreading her arms, "is all that remains. I eat the same bread you do, no more, no less. If you doubt me, ask my servants. If you believe me, stand with me. Together, we will endure." Silence followed. The men shifted uneasily. Some lowered their weapons. The mother with the infant broke into sobs, not of rage, but of exhaustion. At last, the priest stepped forward. "She speaks true. We must trust her, for rebellion will bring only blood, and still no bread." The torches dimmed in the snow. Slowly, the crowd dispersed, but Isabelle knew this was only a fragile piece, like ice, too thin to carry weight. The breath of death. Yet hunger was not the only enemy. By midwinter, sickness slithered into the village. It began with fevers. Then came the coughing, wet and ragged, echoing in the cottages. Within days, whole families lay pale as wax, their skin blotched with crimson. The priest named it the winter fever, though Isabelle knew well enough that hunger had carved the path for death to walk. Malnutrition made every cough sharper, every chill deadlier. Isabelle ordered herbs fetched from the apothecary stores, thyme, rosemary, honey. She sent healers to the huts with warm broth and woolen blankets. But still, the bell in the chapel tolled too often, marking the graves dug beneath frozen soil. One night, her maid collapsed in the hall, her forehead hot as fire. Isabelle carried her herself to the chamber, refusing to let the servants touch her with fear. For 3 nights, she sat beside the girl's bed, spooning broth between her lips, cooling her brow with damp cloths. The girl lived, but Isabelle's own face grew pale, her voice thin with weariness. Etienne begged her to rest. "If you fall ill, my lady, who will guide us?" "I cannot rest while my people suffer," she replied softly. "If they endure the fever, then so shall I." The weight of rule. By February, Valmont seemed a land of shadows. Fires burned low, bellies ached, and graves lined the edge of the forest. Yet through it all, Isabelle stood like a figure carved of stone. She walked each day among her people, speaking words of hope, though her own heart trembled. Some nights, she returned to her chamber and wept silently, so that none might hear. For she knew the truth. She was only 15, a child herself, yet already carrying the sorrow of 1,000 souls. Still, her resolve hardened. If the kingdom forgets us, if the king demands tribute while my people starve, then let him curse my defiance. Better I lose favor at court than see Valmont's fields fall silent forever. The snow that had seemed eternal began at last to weep. Drops of water traced lines down the dark wooden beams of cottages, and rivulets trickled from the hills. The thaw had come. But it was not gentle. The land did not return to life with laughter. It groaned, as though waking from a nightmare. The river's wrath. The great melt swelled the river beyond its banks. Where once children had skated upon its frozen skin, now dark waters tore free, rushing through the fields. Wooden bridges groaned, then shattered under the flood. Livestock, too weak to move, drowned where they stood tethered. "First hunger, now the flood," a farmer muttered as he watched his pasture vanish. "What curse lies upon us?" The people, exhausted from winter's cruelty, looked toward the castle again. Not with anger this time, but with hollow eyes, searching for some spark of guidance. Isabelle stood upon the ramparts, the wet wind pulling at her hair. Etienne stood beside her, silent. "It is as though the earth itself rebels," she whispered. "Then we must show the earth we do not break," Etienne replied. Seeds of desperation. With the fields drowned and the grain stores empty, all hope fixed upon spring planting. Yet the seed sacks were few, most already ground into bread long before. Farmers begged for seed to sow, lest another year of famine follow. Isabelle called her council. The steward argued to keep seed for the castle alone. If we give it all to the peasants, we risk the family's survival. But Isabelle struck the table with her palm. What family survives if its people perish? A lord is nothing without those who till his soil. Give them the seed, every last sack. Better we starve together than live as masters over graves. Her words silenced the hall. The order was carried out. Peasants knelt in mud, cradling the sacks as though they were holy relics. For a moment, hope flickered again. Shadows still linger, yet the fever had not vanished with the snow. The dampness bred new coughs. Children too weak from winter fell ill and never rose again. A burial bell rang almost daily. The priest, gaunt but unbroken, preached to the weary crowd. Suffering refines the soul, as fire refines iron. Hold fast, for Easter nears. Isabelle herself grew thinner, her hands white as parchment. Still she went from hut to hut, blessing children, touching brows with warmth. Many whispered she was more saint than lady. Yet behind closed doors, she wept into her pillow, knowing her strength was borrowed from faith alone. Rumors of war. Even as the villagers clung to survival, word came from beyond Valmont. Messengers brought tidings of unrest in the kingdom, lords feuding over land, whispers of rebellion against the crown. More troubling still, riders from the north carried darker news. Mercenary bands roved the countryside, taking food by force, burning villages, seizing young men for soldiers. One night, Etienne spoke low in the hall. "If they come to Valmont, my lady, we cannot resist long. Our walls are strong, but our men are weak from hunger." Isabelle raised her chin. "Then we must prepare, not with pride, but with cunning. Build ditches at the forest edge, sharpen stakes, train every boy who can lift a bow. If war seeks us, it shall not find us unready." The burden of hope. As spring's first green shoots pierced the thawing earth, the people of Valmont planted seed with trembling hands. Every grain pressed into the soil was a prayer. Some cursed the heavens, others wept as they worked. But all turned to Isabelle with a kind of desperate faith. She had given them seed, courage, and a reason to rise each dawn. At night, alone in her chamber, Isabelle wrote by candlelight. "I am but 15, yet the weight of years crushes me. If God grants that this harvest rise, then perhaps Valmont shall live another season. But if war comes, I fear our strength may prove too thin. Still, I cannot falter. For if I falter, then all is lost." The winter in Valmont had been merciless. Snow clung to the castle walls like a suffocating shroud, and the icy wind whistled through the cracks of the towers, carrying with it whispers of unease. Isabelle sat near the hearth, her slender fingers absent-mindedly tracing the carved wooden armrest of her chair. The fire crackled, yet its warmth could not thaw the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her husband, Lord Etienne, had long since departed to the king's court, summoned for council and military preparations. His absence left Isabelle in an ambiguous place, nominally protected, yet practically alone. She was the Lady of Valmont, but every day the burden of that title weighed heavier, pressing down like the iron crown of duty. Beyond the castle walls, fear gnawed at the land. Rumors spread of mercenary bands roaming the countryside, pillaging villages, and leaving smoldering ruins in their wake. Travelers arriving at Valmont's gates spoke of neighboring lords sharpening their swords, preparing not only to defend their own holdings, but to seize the weakened estates of others. War was a contagion that did not respect borders. Once lit, its fire leapt from manor to manor, devouring all. The council in the great hall. One evening, Isabelle gathered the remaining men of the household, the steward Guillaume, the captain of the guard, and a handful of retainers. The great hall was dim, lit by flickering torches whose smoke curled upward into the rafters. The air was heavy with tension. "My lady," Captain Arnaud began, bowing stiffly, "our scouts confirm that a band of mercenaries has been sighted near the southern forests. They number perhaps 200, poorly disciplined but hungry, and hunger makes men desperate." The steward wrung his hands. "They are no ordinary rabble, Lady Isabelle. Many are disbanded soldiers from the last war, men trained with sword and pike. If they turn their gaze here, Valmont will not withstand their fury for long." Isabelle inhaled slowly, steadying her voice, though her heart raced. "And the king? Will he not protect his vassals?" Arnaud and Guillaume exchanged uneasy glances. It was Guillaume who answered, his voice thin. "The king demands more coin before he can send men-at-arms. Coin we no longer have." Silence fell. Isabelle felt the weight of their eyes upon her, not in judgment, but in expectation. In that moment, she understood that though Etienne was away, Valmont looked to her for guidance. The peasants' fear. Meanwhile, in the villages surrounding the castle, life teetered on the brink of collapse. The winter had shriveled the harvest. Grain stores were pitifully low. Families boiled thin gruel from whatever scraps remained, while others gnawed on bark and roots. Coughing echoed in cramped cottages, the sound of illness spreading through weakened bodies. Fear of war mingled with the despair of hunger. "If the soldiers come," muttered one peasant, "they'll take what little we have left." Another spat into the snow. "And the king's men already take too much?" Whispers of rebellion stirred like smoke from hidden embers. It was not yet open defiance, but Isabelle could sense it when she walked among them. Their bows of respect were perfunctory, their eyes shadowed by doubt. The pressure of alliance. In the following week, a messenger arrived from a neighboring lord, Baron de Clermont, a man notorious for his ruthless cunning. He brought a sealed letter, which Isabelle broke open with trembling hands. Lady of Valmont, the times are dark, and wolves circle the weak. Join your strength to mine, and I shall offer protection. Refuse, and I cannot answer for what fortune may befall your lands. Choose wisely, for indecision is peril. Isabelle folded the parchment, her knuckles white. There was no offer of protection, but a veiled threat. De Clermont sought to bind Valmont under his authority, to make her and Etienne vassals in all but name. Yet to refuse him was to invite hostility from a stronger neighbor. Her heart thudded with dread. This was the cruel reality of medieval politics. Alliances forged not from friendship, but from necessity, where the weaker bent to the stronger, or risked annihilation. Isabelle's resolve. That night, Isabelle walked the battlements alone. The moon hung pale above, casting the snow in ghostly light. She could see the dark shapes of the forests stretching into the distance, and beyond them, unseen, the fires of her enemies. She whispered into the cold air, as though speaking to Etienne across the miles. What would you have me do? Surrender Valmont's independence to save its people, or defy the wolves and risk all? No answer came, save the howl of the wind. Yet within her, a decision began to take root. She could not rely solely on the king, nor on neighbors who sought only to exploit her weakness. If Valmont was to endure, it must be through cunning, courage, and perhaps sacrifice. Historical note within the story. In truth, Isabelle's dilemma was not unique. Throughout medieval Europe, noblewomen often found themselves in precarious positions when their husbands were absent. Though women were rarely given formal political power, in practice they frequently acted as regents, guardians of castles, and defenders of their people. Alliances by marriage, fealty, or coercion shaped the survival of entire regions. The fear of mercenary bands was also real. After wars ended, disbanded soldiers often roamed the countryside, forming free companies that lived by plunder. Local lords and peasants alike suffered under their raids. At dawn, Isabelle summoned her council once more. Her voice was clear, stronger than she felt inside. We will not submit blindly to Baron de Clermont, she declared, nor will we abandon our people to mercenaries. We shall fortify our defenses, gather what provisions remain, and send word to Etienne. If Valmont must stand alone, then it shall, but it will stand with dignity. The men bowed, a flicker of renewed determination in their eyes. And though the winter wind still howled, Isabelle felt a spark of warmth kindle in her chest. Not comfort, but resolve. The storm of war loomed, yet she would meet it not as a frightened girl, but as the Lady of Valmont. The castle walls of Valmont stood tall against the winter sky, but within them, the lives of women, noble and peasant alike, were marked by silent burdens. Isabelle, though cloaked in velvet and linen, was no stranger to the invisible chains that bound her sex. She had been married off at 16, her destiny sealed not by her own desire, but by the hands of fathers and lords who bartered her youth for alliances. And yet, even within the security of stone walls, she felt the pressing weight of expectations, duties, and fears that shaped the life of every woman in medieval Europe. The noblewoman's cage. By day, Isabelle moved through the cold chambers, listening to reports, balancing accounts, and ensuring the castle's order. Outwardly, she bore the composure of a lady of rank, but inwardly, she knew her freedoms were fragile. She could not choose her marriage. Her voice in matters of war or law was tolerated only in Etienne's absence. The riches she wore did not belong to her, nor the land she oversaw. They were her husband's by law, her children's by inheritance. Her very body was seen as a vessel for heirs, her worth tied to her ability to produce healthy sons. When she looked at the young girls of her household, maids of 13 or 14 years, already spoken of in terms of dowries and matches, her heart tightened. Childhood for them was fleeting, Soon they too would be veiled, bartered, and bound to men they scarcely knew. The peasant woman's chains. Outside the castle, the life of a village woman was even harsher. While her husband plowed the frozen fields or marched in service to a lord, she bore the weight of survival. She rose before dawn to stoke the hearth, tend to livestock, fetch water from the well, and prepare what meager food the season allowed. Her hands cracked and bled from the cold, her back bent from endless toil. Childbirth was her greatest trial. Without physicians, without herbs enough to ease the agony, many women died giving life. Those who survived bore child after child, for it was expected, and for many families, necessary to ensure enough children lived to adulthood. The graveyards bore silent testimony, countless small crosses for children lost to fever, hunger, or plague. And yet, even in grief, the burden did not lighten. If her husband fell in war or succumbed to disease, the widow faced not freedom, but desperation, struggling to feed her children, vulnerable to exploitation by stronger men, sometimes forced into remarriage against her will. The unspoken suffering. What united noble and peasant women alike was silence. Pain was endured quietly. The arranged marriage, the lost child, the bruises from a husband's anger, the exhaustion of endless labor. To complain was to appear weak. To rebel was unthinkable. The church preached obedience, wives to husbands, daughters to fathers, women to men. And yet, in the shadows, women found their own ways of strength. Some turned to herbs and midwifery, preserving knowledge that sustained generations. Some wrote prayers and songs, leaving behind voices that whispered of hidden sorrow and fleeting joys. Others, like Isabelle, discovered resilience in necessity, learning to command when men were gone, to protect when danger pressed too close. A conversation by the fire. One night, Isabelle sat with Anne, her most trusted maid, beside the kitchen fire. The air smelled of smoke and broth, the only warmth in the long hall. "My lady," Anne said softly, "sometimes I think God gave us women greater strength than men, though the world refuses to see it." Isabelle looked into the girl's young eyes, already weary beyond her years. "Strength is not always in the sword or the shout," she replied. "It is in endurance, in carrying what must be carried, even when the world does not thank us." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks in the shutters, carrying with it the echo of all the women whose lives were bound by silence, sacrifice, and unseen courage. Historical reflection within the tale. In medieval Europe, the lives of women and girls were shaped by rigid hierarchies. Marriage age. Noble girls were often betrothed at 12-14, sometimes married by 15 or 16. Consent was rarely theirs to give. Legal rights. Women had little legal autonomy. Lands and wealth passed through fathers, husbands, or sons. Even widows were pressured into remarriage to secure alliances. Work. Peasant women labored alongside men in the fields while also maintaining the household. Noblewomen managed estates, but lived under constant scrutiny. Health. Childbirth was perilous, and maternal mortality was common. With poor medical knowledge, women often turned to midwives and herbal remedies. Religion and morality. The church upheld the ideal of women as obedient, modest, and chaste. Female saints and the Virgin Mary were models of virtue, but ordinary women were often treated with suspicion and bound by strict codes. As Isabelle rose to retire, she placed a hand on Anne's shoulder. "Perhaps one day," she whispered, "our daughters will see a gentler world. But until then, we must endure. For them." In her heart, Isabelle knew the truth, that the story of women in her time was not one of glory sung in ballads, but of quiet strength that held the world together, while men claimed its victories. And so the night stretched on, heavy with silence, but also with the unspoken power of women who bore the weight of ages. The winter of Isabelle's youth had long passed, but its memory remained sharp, like frost that lingers even in spring. As she stood at the balcony of her chamber, now silver-haired and slowed by years, she gazed upon the valley below, fields where peasants bent their backs, where children laughed despite hunger, where women carried the world on shoulders no one else saw. Her own life had been written in duty. Married at 16, a mother soon after, a widow before her 40th year. She had played her role as wife, mother, and lady of a castle with all the strength she could summon. Yet, when she looked back, she saw clearly the true history of her age was not in kings' wars or noble treaties, but in the unbroken endurance of women, of herself, of Anne, of countless others whose names would never be recorded in chronicles. The last winter. In that final winter, whispers of unrest reached Valmont. Villagers, worn thin by famine and tax, gathered at night to murmur of justice. Isabelle, too old to ride into courts or councils, listened from her chair as her son spoke of the danger. She remembered the faces of the women she had known, maids lost to childbirth, wives bent from labor, girls wed before their time. And she thought, perhaps it is their voices that echo now, rising at last against silence. The church bells tolled one bitter morning, their sound carried by a wind that swept the valley bare. Isabelle closed her eyes, and for the first time in many years, she prayed not for peace in the realm, but for gentleness in the lives of women yet unborn. Legacy of quiet strength. History would not remember her as it did queens or saints. Yet in the kitchens, stories lingered of a lady who sat with her maids by the fire, who listened when others commanded, who carried her burdens without breaking. Among the villagers, mothers told their daughters, the Lady of Valmont knew our suffering, though she wore silk and we wore wool. Isabelle's story became less a tale of wealth and power than of survival, courage, and the unseen threads women wove to hold families and kingdoms together. A world beyond hers. When the spring thaw finally came, Isabelle passed from this world, her hand clasped by her granddaughter, a girl of 13, already spoken of for marriage. The child wept, not knowing that her own fate mirrored her grandmother's, that the centuries would change slower than the seasons. But history is a river, and each life adds its drop. Isabelle's quiet endurance, like the endurance of millions of women across medieval Europe, fed into that river, carrying forward whispers of change. In time, though far beyond her sight, women's voices would grow stronger, their rights fought for, their worth no longer measured solely by obedience or heirs. Epilogue. The Echo in Time. The story of Isabelle and her age is not one of bright victories or famous battles. It is a tapestry woven of sacrifice, silence, and endurance. It is the tale of girls wed too young, of mothers lost in childbirth, of widows left to fend for their children, of noble ladies turned into pawns of alliances, and yet, through all, of women who carried the weight of generations with unyielding resilience. Their names may be forgotten, but their strength is not. For even now, centuries later, when we walk among the ruins of castles or read the chronicles of kings, we may still hear the faintest echo, the heartbeat of women who endured, who hoped, and who, in their own quiet way, shaped the course of history. And so, Isabelle's life closes like a candle at dusk, but the flame she bore, the silent flame of all women of her time, burns on, lighting the path for those yet to come.